As the Doctor has tried a tactic to return to the 20th century, Barbara burns herself on the TARDIS console, with the Doctor tasking Susan to check the fault locator to see what is wrong. Soon after this, the TARDIS's doors open in flight, with the Doctor telling the others that they must close the doors immediately. The TARDIS eventually lands, but the Doctor is still worried that the doors being opened in flight have caused some sort of problem, but Susan reports back that no faults are being displayed this time. As they turn on the scanner, its screen shatters, like the visuals were too big to display, forcing them to exit the TARDIS and check the surroundings themselves. The four of them exit and decide to split up, with the Doctor and Barbara going in one direction, while Ian and Susan in the other. When Barbara notices a huge dead snake, her and the Doctor marvel at how big it is. Meanwhile, Ian and Susan notice huge elongated egg-like objects leading directly to a large dead ant. The Doctor has figured out that the supposed snake is actually a huge earthworm. The Doctor notices a pattern in their environment, deducing that there is some kind of intelligence to this. Ian and Susan come across a huge sign which reveals that they are in Norfolk and thus on Earth, making the situation even more puzzling. As the Doctor notices a manufactured object, he inadvertently causes it to fall over, revealing that it is a used matchstick, with Susan and Ian finding its matchbox source, causing the Doctor and Susan to both figure out what has happened. The TARDIS's faulty materialisation has made the four travellers a lot smaller than they should be, at only an inch tall, with the pressure from the outside of the TARDIS during flight causing them to reduce in size upon landing. Suddenly, the area goes all dark, causing Ian and Susan to quickly flee, which is soon revealed to be the boot of an individual who picks up the box of matches. Susan, being separated from Ian, calls out for Barbara, who quickly runs to her aid, with Ian having disappeared due to hiding in the matchbox. The Doctor decides to climb onto one of the large path stones to look at their surroundings, noticing that they are close to a house with a man outside, who the three assume is the person who picked up the matchbox. The man is approached by an individual known as Mr. Forrester. The man, Mr. Farrow, has written a report that implicates Forrester in some sort of crime, but he has yet to inform anyone of this. Forrester has created an insecticide known as DN6 with an individual called Smithers. Forrester wants to start selling it to secure his fortune, though this cannot happen as it is lethal to anything it comes into contact with, and with insects being a vital part of the ecosystem, the insecticide cannot be given clearance. With Farrow certain that he cannot allow DN6 to be manufactured, Forrester holds him at gunpoint. A dead bee lands in front of the three travellers, with them noticing that it smells the same as the dead creatures they had encountered before, with them deciding that they cannot eat or drink anything in order to prevent them potentially suffering the same fate. Suddenly, they hear a loud explosion sound, which is revealed to have been Forrester killing Farrow in cold blood. Ian decides now is the time to climb out of the box of matches where he encounters the now deceased Farrow. He quickly reunites with the others and informs them of this, with them following him back to the scene of the crime, quickly deciding to return to the TARDIS. However, before they can do so, Susan realises a cat has taken an unfortunate interest in them. Ian and the Doctor inform the others to not move or look into the cat's eyes. The cat loses interest and leaves. Susan's idea of contacting others for help is deemed pointless due to how there is criminal activity. Before they can start their journey back to the TARDIS while the cat is elsewhere, Another large foot approaches them, causing them to split up again. Barbara and Ian decide to hide in Farrow's briefcase, while the Doctor and Susan head for one of the water pipes on the house itself. Smithers is now at the scene of the crime, with Forrester fabricating the events that led up to Farrow's death, though Smithers can tell that this doesn't match with the wound on the body, and informs Forrester that he should not inform the police of this. Smithers was particularly irritated with how minute Farrow was with the details of his experiments, but still thinks that there was a better way to deal with this situation than outright killing him. Forrester decides to frame a situation where Farrow's holiday boat had overturned at sea, covering up his crime, something Smithers doesn't want any part in. While Farrow wants money, Smithers wants fame, though he justifies this by stating he will save people from starvation. Forrester moves the briefcase containing Ian and Barbara into the interior lab of the house, before moving Farrow's body into the storage room. The Doctor and Susan have reached the drain pipe, where they decide to climb the inside via the corrosion that has formed hand and footholds, with this being the only way they can get into the lab and thus back with Ian and Barbara. Ian and Barbara explore the lab and notice large pieces of wheat. Barbara picks one up and discovers it's all sticky, while Ian notices a book of litmus paper before he realises that they've sprayed the wheat with some new kind of insecticide, being unaware that Barbara has already touched it. Ian decides to locate a bunch of paper clips in order to form a ladder to get back to ground level, while he dismisses Barbara's hope of the briefcase they arrived in containing more information on the insecticide. A giant fly approaches Barbara, but she collapses. Ian quickly carries her into cover as he hears people entering the room. Smithers is frustrated with how easily Forrester can forget about the murder he has committed, with Forrester abusing how much Smithers cares about the creation of DN6, as well as using his knowledge of the murder to his advantage. Susan and the Doctor have finally managed to climb into the sink, though this has taken a good deal of energy from him. Barbara suddenly wakes up, and Ian informs her that the fly has died, landing on the wheat seeds as Forrester and Smithers entered the room. Barbara wants to examine it to make sure, with Ian stating how the fly died instantly, distressing her further. But before she gets the chance to tell him she's touched one of the seeds, they hear Susan call out to them from the sink that amplifies her voice, though regular humans can't hear her due to their miniaturization, causing the frequency to be much higher than usual. Ian and Barbara notice them in the sink, with them having to make what to them is the equivalent of a 30-feet drop to reach them via the plug chain. Smithers and Forrester have been cleaning up the crime scene and are now in need of the sink to wash their hands, with Ian and Barbara having to climb back onto the table as a result. Smithers becomes aware of the fly's death due to DN6, with Forrester still lying to Smithers about Farrow's report. Ian and Barbara peek out of cover and notice Smithers standing at the sink, who turns the tap on and pulls out the plug. The Doctor and Susan quickly make their way into the overflow pipe, narrowly avoiding the water. Not knowing this, Barbara assumes they've drowned, with Ian thinking that they should investigate to be sure. They are quickly surprised when the pair climb out of the sink unharmed. Forrester has forged edits to Farrow's report and plans to phone the department to tell them the results, impersonating him. This worries Smithers, as it'll reveal the crime he's implicated in. Forrester does this anyway, though the exchange operator Hilda notices that he doesn't sound like Farrow. The four travellers look at the notebook, which contains the formula for DN6, but they need to write it down on something their size so they can read it all at once, where they discover that it's an everlasting insecticide and that in enough quantity is even lethal to humans. They decide that a telephone could be the key to preventing DN6 from being spread. Barbara starts to get more and more tired as they all maneuver multiple corks that will assist them in being able to operate the phone by holding it up. The phone gets through to the exchange, with the Dr. Ian and Susan all shouting that they want to be put through to the police, though unfortunately this doesn't work. As Ian decides to get Barbara some water, she refuses to give him her handkerchief before again collapsing, with the three finally discovering she has been infected by the pesticide. Barbara soon wakes up, with the doctor telling her that these effects are only temporary, but that they must return her to her full size in order for her body to fight off the poison. Though Ian finds this hard to accept, they decide that their priority should be preventing DN6 from getting manufactured. Smithers wants to look for himself what Farrow reported. With this alerting Forrester, he decides to configure his gun. The doctor decides that starting a fire would be a good next step in order to alert people to the location. Forrester notices the corks under the phone and blames Smithers for this. Hilda is still on the other end of the line and is now actively aware of Forrester's deception, but plays along in order to get more confirmation, having police officer Burt with her during this, who decides to visit the house to investigate. Smithers has returned to the garden and realises that DN6 has killed all the life forms, forcing Forrester to come clean with him, but now he has to take care of Smithers as well. Ian and Susan are able to light a fire with one of the matchsticks from earlier. Meanwhile, Barbara and the doctor turn on the gas. Forrester forces Smithers back into the lab in order to get Farrow's briefcase when Forrester gets caught in the resulting gas explosion, blinding him just as Officer Burt apprehends the pair. As the Travellers quickly make their escape, the Doctor securely picks up a seed covered with DN6. Back on the TARDIS, the Doctor uses the seed to show Ian the process of them returning to normal size, as Barbara wakes up, now being able to fight off the poison. The Doctor gets the others to clean themselves up, while he notices the scanner is still malfunctioning. As they begin to materialise, he gets excited about soon discovering where their next destination will be. As the second to last serial produced in the initial 52 block of episodes, Planet of Giants would have gotten the letter I as its production letter, but due to a policy at the BBC to prevent confusion between that letter and the number 1, it was instead skipped over and given the letter J. The serial was written by Louis Marks, while its first 2 episodes were directed by Mervyn Pinfield. The third was credited to Douglas Camfield, while Verity Lambert produced the entire serial. Richard Martin was originally intended to direct, but he was moved to direct the following serial instead. William Hartnell, Jacqueline Hill, Carol Ann Ford, and William Russell are all present for this story, with it being the first time since Marco Polo that all 4 of them were featured fully in every episode, with none of them being on holiday during the recording. The origin of Planet of Giants can be traced right back to the start of the show, where the first story before it, which was replaced with An Unearthly Child, was originally planned to feature the characters get miniaturized after the TARDIS was to take off for the first time, landing back in the same place, with the story that followed involving Colehill's school and the police officer that is only featured very briefly at the start of An Unearthly Child itself. This version of the story was only half written when it was dropped, and was written by one of the pioneers of the show, C.E. Weber, before Anthony Coburn would be brought on to write what became the first produced serial of Doctor Who, with Lime Grove Studio D being deemed unfit to pull the serial's effects off, lacking the type of cameras they needed to depict a shrinking TARDIS. The general idea of the Doctor and companions being shrunk in size had always been liked, especially by script editor David Whittaker, who refused to completely discard the idea, so they had always kept a rough plan to incorporate this type of story into the show, with the serial being placed into the latter half of the show's first season, with Robert Gould initially being commissioned to write a new story around the idea in the latter half of 1963, but this wouldn't go anywhere by January 1964, with the writer being asked to write another story instead, before he was dropped from scripting a story for the show altogether. The story was eventually given to Louis Marks, who was commissioned on the 11th of May 1964 to write the then planned 4-part serial, which was referred to as the Minisucles, with delivery dates for the first 2 scripts being the 12th of June and the latter 2 scripts being the 26th of June. By the 22nd of July, Marx's scripts for episodes 2 to 4 of Planet of Giants were accepted, with insert shots for all 4 of the episodes being recorded at Ealing Studios just a week later, featuring all 4 of the main cast members, with remount shots being carried out on the 13th of August, after some of the initial miniature shots were not up to standard. Episode 2's working title was Death in the Afternoon. The recording for the bulk of the 4 episodes took place between the 21st of August and the 11th of September 1964, with all 4 episodes being recorded in the much preferred Television Centre 4, with this being the first serial to completely drop using any of the Lime Grove studios. After these 4 episodes were edited, it was decided by BBC head of serials, Donald Wilson, who thought the story didn't work as 4 parts, to truncate the serial down into just 3 episodes, using scenes of the latter 2 that were recorded, while including the original episode 3's title of Crisis and the end credits from the original version of episode 4, The Urge to Live, with this requiring the fewest edits, which was a more costly process to carry out in the 1960s. Mervyn Pinfield directed the original version of episode 3, but due to them using the episode 4 credits, he went uncredited for his scenes. Donald Wilson also wished that they could swap the serial around with the Dalek invasion of Earth, which would have been a better opening story for season 2, but they ultimately couldn't do this due to Susan's departure making it impossible. While the 3 episodes exist as 60mm negative telerecording copies that were found in 1978, the original cuts of the 3rd and 4th episodes no longer exist, as they weren't retained or copied, unlike the truncated transmitted version, meaning that the original version of the latter half of this serial, as recorded, is regarded as lost media. The first cut to the footage recorded for episode 3 Crisis was a sequence between Forrester and Smithers while the former was washing his hands, where he discusses more about his plan to fake the circumstances of Farrow's death, with Forrester reminding Smithers how he is also implicated in the death due to helping him move the body. The cat from the end of episode 1 returned in removed scenes, where it jumps onto the desk and enters the sink, with Barbara and Ian assuming it was laying on one side in order to drink some water, though it ends up in reality having died due to coming into contact with DN6. An additional scene of Forrester imitating Farrow's handwriting was present before making the edits to Farrow's report itself, with Smithers doubting that Forrester's writing can match Farrow's under analysis. Smithers also asks more questions about Farrow's motives. The 4 Travellers have a much longer sequence where they analyse the sticky seeds, with the Doctor deducing that it's the same thing that killed all the life forms they encountered in the garden, with Barbara wrongly suggesting that Farrow was killed for inventing it, while the Doctor correctly assumes it was because Farrow was opposed to its use, with the Doctor noting how, for once, they are going to meddle in events after he has condemned that action in the past, though this time they have to because otherwise this invention could destroy the planet, with the Doctor defiant that he will not stand by and let that happen. The first scene in the telephone exchange with Hilda was more extended, with her explaining more of the situation to Officer Burt. She states how she is suspicious that it isn't actually Farrow on the line, while there is also extra conversation between Forrester and Smithers once the call has ended. The original version of Crisis Also included a sequence of the TARDIS Travellers repeating out the formula and plotting it down, which the final cut established but actually skipped over the process of them doing it. An additional scene of Forrester calling the telephone exchange was present, further having Hilda doubt that he is Pharaoh, after Forrester calls without the disguise to his voice, which she recognises as the same voice who previously claimed to be Pharaoh, with Officer Burt doubting her. This dynamic ultimately being a casualty of the cuts to the final episodes, as well as more background information on Officer Burt having been knocked off his bike by an American car earlier in the day. An explanation for the TARDIS Travellers using the telephone, despite their voices being high frequency, was cut, where the Doctor hypothesises whether the frequency would change through the telephone wires. The four have to quickly hide after making their call, when Smithers enters the room and lights a cigarette, with the smoking causing them to cough, before Smithers picks up his notebook containing the DN6 formula and leaves the room. Another cut scene, following the previous, is one of Forrester making a call to someone called Jimmy, who has only got 10 salesmen to agree to sell DN6, with this not being good enough for Forrester, who wants it to be more widespread. Forrester also mentions that they are still trying to figure out a brand name that will make it sell quicker, with Forrester planning to meet with the production factory's managers, who will want Smithers and the DN6 formula present. Smithers, wanting any excuse to leave the house, is happy for this, though he is increasingly annoyed at how Forrester has this all planned out. Forrester yet again calls the telephone exchange, with Hilda deciding to make him wait while she has other matters to attend to. An explanation for why Forrester doesn't try calling while the Travellers have triggered the other phone was removed, where he states he is waiting for a while because he assumes that Hilda isn't available after not accepting his last call. The original cliffhanger for Crisis was Barbara collapsing after telling the others not to touch her handkerchief, with them quickly discovering she's been infected by DN6, with the camera panning on Barbara after Susan states that they must be able to do something, with the caption for the next episode, the ultimately unused, The Urge to Live, being listed. Additional dialogue was present when Barbara regained consciousness. Another sequence of Hilda trying to convince Burt that something is going on at the farmhouse was also cut, where Hilda suggests they could be criminals, though Burt dismisses this as part of her imagination, before Hilda sends an alert tone down the line which hurts the four Travellers' ears, forcing them to move away from the phone quicker. There was an additional scene where Forrester again notices that this situation with Pharaoh is bothering Smithers, where he tells him to snap out of it, reminding him to stick to the fabricated story. But instead, Smithers is getting more suspicious of what Forrester told him about Pharaoh's motives. Forrester sticks to his fabricated story, despite Smithers knowing that it doesn't all add up, with the scene giving Smithers some additional backbone not present in the final cut of the serial. An additional sequence of the Travellers' plan to return to the sink was cut, where Barbara is stubborn to do anything else, with the three others pleading with her to move, but she feels like she is already dead, and that they should focus on making sure the rest of the world doesn't suffer this fate. The scene exemplifies how much the others care for Barbara, with only the ending of this scene being kept in the final edit. A scene of Hilda revealing to Burt that the American car that knocked him down earlier is now located at the same house was present, with it adding to the overall reason why Burt goes to investigate, while also continuing to show Hilda's job outside of the plot, which is also the case for her previous cut scenes, something that was completely removed from the final edit. Hilda is annoyed that the phone is still off the hook. There was a follow-up of the cat having died, where Smithers notices that it's not moving before realising it's no longer alive. Forrester coldly tells him to get rid of it, before thinking it could be the reason why the phone is off the hook. Smithers notices the cat's fur is sticky, with the scene that is present in the final edit where he realises that it's DN6 was scripted as him discovering it from the cat. We would have actually got to see Smithers read some of Farrow's report, which explains that he was the one who sprayed some of the garden in order to see what the results were. Smithers wants to see said results, but Forrester feigns that they don't exist, though Smithers can tell that it wasn't written by someone who was blackmailing them, angrily leaving the lab. As Smithers realises the life in the garden has all died due to DN6, Forrester informs him that he has placed Farrow's body in his car, where he plans to enact his cover-up. Smithers confronts him knowing that he knew DN6 was lethal, with the scene further showing how little Forrester cares about anything but the money he will make from it, while also revealing that Smithers did genuinely think DN6 was going to do good to the world. Smithers accuses Forrester of murdering Farrow, with Forrester simply replying, yes. A brief scene of the 4 travellers escaping back down the drainpipe was cut, with the ending sequence in the TARDIS being longer, with them having to wait more until they can return to their normal size, with the Doctor having to repeat what he did when they initially landed, using the scanner to achieve this. An on-screen countdown is then shown as they begin to dematerialise. Additional explanation for why the seed didn't grow with them is given, with the Doctor stating that it's like the insecticide within Barbara, it's got stable molecules, so it won't change size, with Susan being happy that this means Barbara will recover. The final edit of the 3 episodes were transmitted on BBC One between the 31st of October and the 14th of November 1964, with the decision being made beforehand that the show would take a break and would broadcast these as the start of the show's 2nd season in the autumn of 1964. Planet of Giants is one of the few stories within the First Doctor era that is neither a historical or a sci-fi futuristic story, instead being what is described as a minuscule tale, with the TARDIS Travellers being miniaturised by the TARDIS, with the story seemingly taking place in the then present day, though no date is given on screen. 3 dates have been accredited to this story via different sources, being 1963, 1964, and one set 5 years after the story was broadcast in June 1969. The serial itself would be a first of its kind, with the overall modern-day Earth espionage plot that would later be more prominently featured within the show once Jerry Davis took over as script and story editor. Carol Ann Ford and William Russell remembered this story as one where they talked a lot, with it having very little action. William Russell distinctively remembered himself the scene featuring the giant matches, stating how they felt more like telegraph poles. During the production of Planet of Giants, David Whittaker stepped down as script editor, but stayed on to complete his contracted work on the following serial, The Dalek Invasion of Earth, as well as write the one after that, The Rescue, when it was quickly decided they needed a 2-part story to introduce Susan's successor, with him ultimately leaving by the time his contract expired in late October 1964. At the time the story released, the sentence for murder in the UK was death, with Forrester's story post his arrest never being told anywhere within the Doctor Who universe. It can be assumed this is what ultimately became of him. The Doctor references the Reign of Terror when he mentions having just been to the late 18th century, though the expanded Doctor Who universe has retconned this to be other stories. Susan and the Doctor later reference an unseen adventure involving air raids and zeppelins during the Blitz. Telesnaps for Planet of Giants were created upon its broadcast, but are missing, with these probably not being sought out by many people due to the 3 episodes existing as 60mm telerecordings. Many years later, Season 10 would contain another story where the characters are shrunk down, that being Carnival of Monsters, before the modern series would feature another with Series 8's Into the Dalek. Planet of Giants was initially planned for release on VHS in 1995, but these provisional plans never came to pass, with the VHS for the story not being released until 7 years later in 2002, being the last story from Season 2 to get released on the format, and being the last standalone story release for the first Doctor in this range. In August 2012, Planet of Giants would be restored for release on DVD, with a reconstruction of the original cuts of Crisis and The Urge to Live included, which were created as a special feature for the DVD release, having scenes from existing footage, newly created CGI sequences, and new dialogue recorded by the surviving cast and sound-alikes, filling in the gaps that had been cut during the truncation. At the time of the DVD release, the only 3 surviving people involved during the production of the story were Carol Ann Ford, William Russell, and designer Raymond Cusick, with the latter 2 having sadly passed away before the making of this video, leaving Carol as the only surviving member left from the story as of 2025. Due to the lack of surviving cast and crew, instead of creating a making-of documentary, they created a documentary about the recreation of the original 3rd and 4th episodes. Season 2, including Planet of Giants, was the 12th release in the Doctor Who The Collection range, which would be the first time the BBC would standardise releasing the classic stories in their release seasons via physical media. Season 2's limited edition set was released on the 5th of December 2022, while the standard edition came 2 years later on the 2nd of December 2024. Besides the previously made DVD content, the collection set features newly restored versions of the episodes, as well as includes a bunch of PDF documents, including rehearsal and camera scripts, as well as an in-depth in-conversation interview with William Russell. In 2023, Planet of Giants was released as part of the classic Doctor Who back catalogue on BBC iPlayer, making it available to stream in the UK, which was previously stuck behind a paywall on BritBox, though the rights to the story could expire in the future, which has been the case with several later season stories. Planet of Giants was novelised in 1990, written by Doctor Who script editor veteran Terrance Dicks, being the last story within William Hartnell's era of the show to be novelised. This novelisation was later released in audiobook form in May 2017, narrated by Carol Ann Ford. While the Doctor's clearly accounting for his character arc progression, he's still got that grumpy characteristic mixed in there when he's under pressure, with him not wanting to explain things to Ian and Barbara, dismissing their questions based on them being from the 20th century, which he regards as primitive. This being worked into his character growth by him apologising just afterwards, blaming himself for said pressure. Barbara's response of "there's nothing to forgive" really cements by this point how they are practically found family to each other, which makes her and Ian's departure later in the series more so heartbreaking to watch. Ian's science teacher background is utilised when he speaks about his knowledge of the worker ant protecting the eggs at all costs. The Doctor shows care to Barbara, protecting her from the matchstick he accidentally knocks over. This is shown again when he decides to climb onto the large stone instead of her, though these can also be interpreted as sexist writing or directing from the era the story was produced in. Unfortunately, Susan's stereotypical Earth teenager qualities are present in this serial when she instantly screams for Barbara after being separated from Ian. Though, her otherworldly intelligence is still factored into the first episode, with her figuring out what has happened to them at the same time as the Doctor. This sort of giving a middle ground to her characterization, though it was too little too late, as she had already been cemented as leaving the show in the following serial. I think the plot of having the insecticide that kills all living things was an effective way to allow the production to portray the huge version of the insects without having to make them move, which would have definitely been a harder thing to accomplish back in the 1960s, especially on the budget Doctor Who had. Though they did briefly portray a living fly in episode 2, it wasn't seen fully moving due to said limitations, with Ian explaining what happened to it, with it moving off screen. The topic of DN6 itself is somewhat before its time, with it sharing qualities with microplastics and forever chemicals. It is everlasting and very damaging to the environment's ecosystem, with this also being a topic that would have fit very well within a story set during John Pertwee's era of the show, like The Green Death, which dealt with the Earth being polluted by unbreakable and everlasting waste. This topic also reminded me of Praxeus from the modern show's Series 12. Forrester feels like a villain that would fit in a James Bond movie, with the entire plot being something that also could work within one without the miniaturization aspect of the story. Barbara's statement of them being freaks because they're small people and they'd be put into glass and made into scientific specimen is an unfortunate reality, which especially aligns up with the antagonist of this serial that cares little about others when it comes to making himself wealthy. Barbara ends up tripping over in the second episode, spraining her ankle, with it feeling like they resort to her doing that when they need to add some level of action to a scene, though it's a trope I dislike, as it seems a very stereotypical thing that they make her do in order to extend the runtime of an episode, and is soon quickly forgotten about. Though thankfully, this and Susan's overly stereotyped teenage girl archetype is the only two things I outright dislike in these episodes, with that not being the serial's fault itself. Even so, I can't forget how the characters care for each other despite them being written/directed like this, because the show did other things that actually benefited Barbara and made her an actual strong character. They could have added more variety by making it be Ian who sprained his ankle for once, that while yes would go against his whole character picture being the young action hero here, he already had an entire season in that role, so they could have switched it up here and had Barbara be the one to help him. We can all sprain our ankle after all. I feel for Barbara when she tries to tell Ian that she's touched the wheat sprayed with insecticide, but he doesn't fully listen to her, with him misreading her distress as her just being stressed by them being miniaturized. You just want Ian to listen to her, instead of him brushing her off, causing her to hide that she's been infected with the DN6, until they end up forcing it out of her via the handkerchief. It also feels like maybe she feels guilty for touching the seeds, and that the Doctor and the others would be disappointed in her, with her perhaps getting the feeling that she must impress the Doctor. Ian further dismissing her idea of a cure for DN6 probably added to this feeling for her, that she felt like she was a bother by mentioning it. I can imagine if we did get this minuscule tale as the first story, that the Doctor would attempt to leave Ian and Barbara behind if he got separated from them while still with Susan, though he doesn't do this in Planet of Giants, because by this point, like I said previously, they have developed into a found family of sorts, with him mellowing out a bit and actually showing some level of care for the humans, as well as admitting his own faults. The Doctor stating to Susan how they must climb the drain pipe to help Ian and Barbara further cements how far he's come since an unearthly child. It's really interesting how the serial can make the simple action of someone washing their hands so terrifying, due to the characters we care about being located in the very sink they are going to use, with the music cue used for that revelation helping to exemplify this oh no moment. The broadcast version of Crisis has a lot of notable fade to blacks, which most likely happened due to them truncating the serial's total runtime, having to cut out in between scenes. The Doctor's enthusiasm to start a fire is something that sort of becomes a mischievous character trait for him, as seen previously in An Unearthly Child, and again later in The Romans, where he accidentally causes the historic fire at the end of that serial and is humoured by it. It's ironic how Forrester getting injured by the very thing he murdered to protect ultimately ends up being his undoing, with it blinding him like his very goal of making a fortune from DN6 blinded him to any humanity he may have once had. Ian's positiveness present in the cut sink scene for Crisis further cements the optimism his character has, with him stating to Barbara that they still should go on living after they assume the Doctor and Susan have drowned. I think it's a shame that the extra scenes showcasing the dynamic between Forrester and Smithers were cut, though perhaps it was best that they cut the return and death of the cat, with it just being an extra unneeded death to show how lethal DN6 is, which we've had enough examples of before, though it does work more effectively for Smithers to discover the true extent of DN6 instead of just realising that everything outside is dead. It's a shame that the cat was only used for the episode 1 cliffhanger and then quickly swept away, with its death in the original intended version of Crisis not adding much more to the plot. Perhaps it could have been used during a sequence of the Travellers' journey back to the TARDIS, with them having to evade or hide from it while trekking back to the ship. A big loss is that they cut the entire sequence where the Doctor was defiant that he cannot stand by and let the planet get destroyed by DN6, with it really being a testament to how far his character arc has come that he knows he cannot leave this be, which is also a nice switch up from the previous season where we had a bunch of stories of him doing just that. The sequence cut of the four reading out the formula to the Doctor reminds me of a similar scene from The Keys of Marinus, where the Doctor plotted out a crime scene, though I do think that this being cut was probably a good thing for the pacing, as the final episode without it still gets the point across well. They could have instead used the following Hilda and Bert telephone exchange scenes as a way to establish the time of the characters being off screen, writing down the formula. The dynamic between Hilda and Bert is another casualty that I think is a shame, as it was practically entirely cut from the serial, with it further establishing how Hilda is vital to foiling Forrester's plot, while Officer Bert is initially skeptical that there is anything amiss, with Hilda being proved right by the end of the serial, showing us how she is very good at her job, to the point where she can recognise and attribute voices to people she has had call her exchange in the past, showing how attentive she is with the calls she receives. We also would have got more insight into how Forrester intends to make a business out of DN6, with him talking about coming up with an effective brand name, as well as having an apartment that he has taken advantage of tax write-offs with. It's a shame that the extended scene of Smithers becoming more suspicious of Forrester was cut from the Urge to Live footage, as it gives him more of a curve to his character arc, where he starts to stick up for what he knows was true, with Forrester keep trying to gaslight him to believe his false version of events. The cut scene of Barbara being very hopeless extends how bad you feel for her compared to the final edited down version, where she is so certain that her fate is sealed, which is contrasted by the three others who have a strong urge for her to carry on and live, with the episode's title most likely being about this topic, that Barbara must have the urge to live, she cannot just give up. The additional scenes from Urge to Live that were cut more outrightly established that Smithers actually wasn't in it for the fame, and didn't realise that DN6 was as lethal as it was, while also adding more to how ruthless and selfish Forrester is, with these adding a lot to the story, whereas the final edit makes it more vague about how much Smithers knew about DN6 before he discovered everything in the garden was dead. I think that the sets they made for the Minuscle characters to work in were really effective, especially the sink, with the BBC pulling this off quite well, despite the lack of budget, which in turn actually allows them to get more creative with stories like this. Overall, I think Planet of Giants is an interesting outing for Doctor Who, showing that the classic show didn't have to stick to its historical past stories or its future monster sci-fi ones to tell interesting stories, though it is a bit underrated. I think that it's a shame that the story was cut down from its intended length, as the majority of those cut scenes work well to flesh out the serial-specific characters, as well as give the Doctor another memorable speech, reminding us of his moral code to do what is right. I now have an active channel membership available. This will grant you exclusive perks like emojis in the comments, usernames listed in my outros, and updates to what's coming next posted exclusively for members in the community tab. But the best feature is you get 5 days early access to new videos and you will be supporting me at the same time. To find out more, you can click the join button on my channel page. Thank you to anyone who considers becoming a channel member. Thank you for watching. Please see the video description below for interesting links, sources and credits. If you enjoyed, please like, subscribe and comment, as it will really help the channel continue to grow. Until the next time, goodbye.